tell us what you...
Okay, he'll be ready in just a second.
That's okay.
And Nina, we'll start again. The first question is about the food, how it was obtained through gardens, the types of foods, and how you prepared it and compare it to today.
Okay.
We're ready now.
When I was a girl, my mother and father always had a garden, and they planted everything. My father didn't know too much about garden work, but my mother was reared on a farm. We had beans and potatoes and cabbage and cucumbers and corn especially. But when I was a child, I didn't like beans and turnip greens and things like that. I can remember the first time I ever ate any greens or beans, but afterward I learned to like them. We would buy, in the summer, my daddy would always buy flour by the barrel and meal, and my mother canned everything. When the berries, strawberries began coming in, she began canning and preserving, and she canned and preserved everything until frost came that killed the last tomatoes. And she would always use the last tomatoes for making chow-chow. But we had a large box in the corner of the kitchen, and she always canned fruit, and when she emptied those cans, we'd wash them and put them in the box. And we had, on the average, of 100 or more jars. We had the old-time half-a-gallon jars, the quart jars, the pint jars. And when we would, when they'd open one of the half-a-gallon jars, that would be a plenty. Say if it is beans or cabbage or kraut or anything like that, that would be a plenty for the family. We would have beans at night and cornbread and a cobbler pie, probably buttermilk. And the lady lived the back of us had a cow, and she sold buttermilk 10 cents a gallon. Now buttermilk is sky high, and we get a half a gallon of sweet milk for 10 and 15 cents. Now I pay $1.15 for half a gallon of skim milk. So at that time, food was very inexpensive, and people raised more of their food than they do now. And hogs. We always had hogs and a cow and a garden. When winter came, we had our food, and we had everything in we needed. They bought flour, as I said, by the barrel, and we always had biscuits for breakfast. Sometimes we'd have biscuits, sometimes my mother would roll them out in what they call hoe cakes. And we had cornbread for dinner and supper. Now they call it lunch and dinner at night. But we always had plenty to eat. We didn't have too much money, but we had plenty to eat. But people wasn't making too much then. My daddy worked all day.
Excuse me, that's fine. You gave us sufficient length. We've got a real good answer on that. So they weren't quick snacks and little sandwiches, but you'd sit down and have a fully prepared meal, and kind of let us know that lunches then were a lot different than what they are now. We're ready.
Okay. For dinner, we didn't say lunch then, it was dinner. And we had a big meal at dinner. Whatever we had, if we had beans in the summertime, we always knew we was going to have green beans and corn and potatoes and tomatoes and cornbread, probably buttermilk, and some kind of a pie. But then children and grown-ups either, we didn't know anything about lunch meat. The only thing that we had then that would be similar to lunch meat now was when they'd kill a hog, they'd use the hog head and the feet and the scraps for making sauce meat. But we always had a heavy meal, what we call dinner time. At night, then we'd have a lighter meal. But my daddy worked at Cherry Company, and he didn't get off until 5 o'clock. But we didn't know, children run to the store now and buy a soft drink, buy a piece of bologna and some bread or crackers. But then we were much healthier too, I think, by having a good, stout, full meal. We didn't have so much of what we call snacks and gimmicks and things.
Excellent. Okay, that's real fine. Look forward and enjoyed Sunday meals where families and friends would get together, and that it was kind of a way to keep in touch with what was going on, and you'd have a big, long meal.
On Sundays, we always planned, my mother always planned a big dinner on Sunday. We had more on Sunday than any other time. We had chickens in the yard. Probably she'd kill a hen or two, sometimes fryers and sometimes both. And we'd invite our friends and neighbors or church members to come go home with us after church. We'd have chicken and dressing, sometimes chicken and dumplings and beans and cornbread. Then we didn't know too much. Well, we didn't have what we call light bread out of the store now, but they would make rolls, and I think the older people made the yeast from what they call hops. I never did know how it was done, but I've seen my mother make bread, and we called it salt rising bread then. We didn't just have the plain bread, it was salt rising. And after dinner, we'd have a big freezer of cream. We'd all the children take a turn and turn in the freezer. After we had our dinner, then we had our ice cream. We'd put in the rest of the custard was left from the first freezer, so we could eat it in the afternoon when the guest was gone. The children had we always had all that we wanted. My mother and father never did stint us. We had plenty to eat any time and all time. So we'd have ice cream late in the afternoon. At night, we'd finish it up when you come in from church. We had a very, very good time. I had a wonderful life so far as a child.
That's fine. That's walking a mile or two to do shopping or visiting or anything.
Just one.
We walked. Well, we didn't know anything about cars. I think I can remember the first time that I heard of a car in Cleveland, but I do not remember the date. My daddy was working at Cleveland Chair Company, and Mr. Millen, he had the first car, and when he came home and told us about it, we were very excited. But we walked everywhere we went, church or whatnot, and they had horses and buggies and sears. But we didn't have a horse and a buggy. We walked from where I live, what we call on Gravel Bank, to town. We shopped. When they first opened up the shopping center here, Mr. Cohen was a manager, and he maneuvered it. And I put a write-up in the paper about him. I said, Mr. Cohen has been an immigrant to Cleveland, but he certainly has brought progress. He's a manager in the first starting of the shopping center in the village. And after he got his started, then on up the line on what they call Keith Street, they began opening up. But that where the Cleveland Village Mall is, that was the Johnson's farm. So when he wanted to buy that, and they say Miss May, Mr. Johnson's daughter, would not sell it. Said as long as the children lived, they'd have a living. So she leased it to him, and he kept it up until this past year. I heard that there's a man came from one of the foreign countries and took over.
Okay, that's fine. Let's do this if we can, Nena. We can use portions of that and whatnot. Let's get back to asking if you can give us a feeling of the distances that you walk, how common. In one day, maybe you walk 5-6 miles, depending on how many trips you had to make to town, or if you wanted to visit a neighbor, you thought nothing about walking a mile over to the neighbor's home. If you can give us a feeling on just how many miles you might walk in a day, so we'll know just how many steps a person had to take back then. You ready here, is it? Okay.
I do not know just how many miles, but where I was reared, from there to the courthouse is supposed to be a mile. We had walked there to town, and then now I walk further, walk down to the village. In fact, I walk as far as I possibly can. I go sometime 2 or 3 times a week. Cab fare is so expensive. And you have a neighbor, you don't want the neighbor to take you free because gas is so expensive. So I get my neighbors sometime, I ride the senior citizen bus, and I walk. I guess on the average, I walk about 5 or 6 miles just about any day I go to town. Then I was a coordinator for the RSVP, but I did not have a car, but I had a friend, and he would carry me in the area. Then I would get out of the car and walk around to the different houses. But I really enjoyed it and appreciated it, and I'm doing quite a bit of volunteer work now. I'm volunteer, Red Cross volunteer at Bradley Memorial Hospital. I volunteer at Contact, which is a teleministry, and I also volunteer in the gift shop at Bradley Memorial, and I do volunteer work out at Bradley Memorial Nursing Home. And I just do most anything that people want me to do or ask me to do. I really enjoy it. I really am not keeping house now. The house is keeping me. So that's one reason why I had to rush this morning to kind of get to you.
Fine, that's fine. All right, one more question. In the city, if you would tell us the common kinds of jobs that people had back when you were a child in the city, and just kind of give us a feeling of how the city and the county in regard to jobs and living were different.
Well, Cleveland never was considered a city. And years ago, I told the urban renewal people that they talking about the back street being an alley. I said, now, years ago, we had nothing but big roads and alleys. I said, what an alley was a narrow street. I said, now, this street back here is not an alley. It says 20-foot alley, but my husband told me 50 years ago, whenever Cleveland began growing, we'd have to give 6 feet off our side of the street and the other people 6. So 6 and 6 is 12, and 12 plus 20 is 32. But so far as the work, the Negroes could not do anything except work in the private homes. They were cooks and nurses. And we had a few Negro teachers. The schools were segregated then. And that was the only thing. I tell the people so often, if they would get out and learn and know the different courses that they could take, then the children could come up wisely and know better. My mother always said, if she ever had any children, she's going to see that they got as much education as she could afford them. So my daddy didn't much want us to be sent away to school, but she said, well, they going. So she went to work. She had never worked any then. And she went in a private home, then she worked in a hotel. And she sent us away, and then after we got started, we just continued. Well, when I came, she was sick one time when I had signed up for a 4-year college course, and I had to cut the course to 2 years. And I came out and I married in 24, and I taught a while. And then when my family began increasing, I didn't work anymore. Well, when my oldest daughter was ready to enter high school, one of the principals called and wanted to know if I didn't want to work. I said, what? I said, you know I can't work. He said, you got a certificate, didn't you, permanent? I said, yeah. He said, come on. So
That's
I
fine,
thought.
Nena. Excuse me, I don't mean to be rude, but that's fine.